Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good
Good
morning.
morning. Okay, good. Let me just say, well, I already said good morning, but I'm sure our dean has already gave welcome, but I'd like to also say how happy I am to have all of you here today with us at the University of Kentucky. And so I'm the moderator for the next panel on Black childhood and fear, and I have been tasked with introducing all of the participants. So I'm going to go in the order that they were listed on the program. So Marjolyn Armstrong, who is in the middle, is an associate professor at Santa Clara University Law School and serves as the academic director of the Law School Center for Social Justice and Public Service. She has published articles and books in the areas of housing, racial discrimination, comparative and constitutional law. Prior to joining the law faculty at Santa Clara, Professor Armstrong practiced public employment law and served as a staff attorney with the Legal Aid Society of Alameda County. She's a graduate of UC Berkeley Bolt Hall School of Law and has served on the board of directors for several community organizations. Laura Naitung Benny is to the far side of me, is a professor of law at the University of Michigan Law School. Her teaching interests span law and economics, finance, political economy, and international development with a focus on Sudan and Africa, and race in the law. Her work has been published in both legal and economic journals, and she is the co-editor with Professor Sandra Hale of the forthcoming volume, Sudan's Killing Fields, Political Violence and Fragmentation, which addresses state violence against marginalized groups in the former Sudan. Professor Benny earned a master's and PhD in economics at Harvard University, her JD at Harvard, and a BA in economics at Stanford University. To my right is Professor Nikki Booth Perry. Professor Perry is a tenured associate professor at Florida A&M University College of Law. Her scholarship focuses on legal professionalism and ethics and the implications of social media, with articles appearing in a number of top-ranked law reviews and journals. She's recognized as a leader in the field and is a fellow for the National Institute for Teaching Ethics and Professionalism and has served as a speaker, panelist, and commentator at a number of national conferences. She's a member of the Florida Supreme Court Special Committee on Professionalism and the ABA Civil Rights Litigation Committee. She has earned numerous awards for pro bono juvenile delinquency work. To her right is Maggie Ellinger-Locke, and Maggie is a St. Louis-based community organizer and practicing attorney with a focus on criminal defense and domestic relations. She holds a JD from City University of New York School of Law and a BA from Antioch College, where she majored in ecofeminism. She is involved in a wide range of pro bono work, including felony representation, PAC support, and civil rights litigation. She has been on the ground in Ferguson, Missouri, since the shooting death of Mike Brown, coordinating legal observers and securing representation for protesters, among other work. Maggie is also extremely active in the fight for food sovereignty. And we have also had a substitution on this panel. And so to my left is Michelle Goodwin. And Michelle is a professor at the University of California at Irvine School of Law. Her research concerns the role of law in the promotion and regulation of medicine, science, and biotechnology. She is a prolific author and public voice on civil liberties and human rights, particularly human trafficking for sex, labor, body parts, and marriage. Reviews of her work appear in the New England Journal of Medicine, Nature, Publishers Weekly, Law and Politics, Book Review, Book News, and the Literary Journal, amongst other periodicals. Her editorials and commentaries appear in the Los Angeles Times, New York Times, Gene Watch, Christian Science Monitor, Cleveland Pain Dealer, Houston Chronicle, I'm an H-Town girl that touches me, Chicago Sun-Times, the Washington Post, Alternate, and Forbes magazine. She's a columnist for the conversation section of the Chronicle of Higher Education magazine and blogs for the Harvard Bill of Rights, Harvard Bill of Health. Professor Goodwin is the founder and the director of the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy at UC Irvine Law School. She's the president of the Defense for Children International U.S. affiliate and founder of the Institute for Global Child Advocacy. Professor Goodwin is the former Everett Fraser Professor in law at the University of Minnesota. She served as a visiting professor at the University of Chicago. And at the University of California at Berkeley and Columbia University Law School. And prior to law teaching, Professor Goodman was a Gilder Lerman postdoctoral fellow at Yale University. These are our panelists for the next hour or so, and we welcome them to begin in which order they prefer. I think Marjolaine is first.
So first of all, I'd really like to thank Anthony for inviting me and for organizing this conference, which is, of course, completely amazing so far. And I'm very thankful to the University of Kentucky for sponsoring the conference. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So my talk is on moving from a culture of predation to a culture of protection of black and other non-white youth. And in preparing this talk, I was doing a lot of research, and I came across writings by one of the people who was going to be speaking today at lunch, Dr. Stacy Patton. And I want to begin with a quote from her, and also to plug her autobiography that Mino yesterday, which is a tremendous book that interweaves scenes from her childhood as an abused foster child with historical documentation of the use of beatings and torture of blacks in slavery, and draws parallels between the contemporary use of corporal punishment and the treatment of slaves. And I think Adrienne Peterson needs to read this article, as well as, or her autobiography, as well as the rest of us, because it's an amazing insight into the culture in which black children aren't protected. And Patton wrote in a piece called Killing Black Children is an American Tradition that black childhood, in the Western sense of the word, has never really existed. And out of a long history of devaluation and dehumanization, white Americans still do not think that black children are actually children, innocent, valued, worthy of protection. Black children have been recognized as an age group, but our children have never conformed to Western notions of childhood. And in looking at these Western notions of childhood, much of the progress in creating modern childhood came through the use of law. In 1924, the League of Nations adopted the Geneva Declaration of the Rights of the Child, and Europeans and Americans have been trying to implement a vision of a protected status for children. The preamble of the Declaration of the Rights of the Child of 1924 says that mankind owes the child the best it has to give. And this reflected a shift in the Western conception of childhood that began in the 17th, 16th centuries, but first focused on upper-class boys, then their sisters, and by the 19th century, middle-class children were beginning to be confined to the home sphere and school and not work. But, of course, working-class children continued to work and to contribute to the support of their families. But gradually, the majority of children as a whole were excluded from the adult world of work, and the period of childhood dependency lengthened. So during this transformative period, white children were sentimentalized and constructed as the standard for childhood, and people began to work in terms of trying to eliminate child labor, and they were transforming childhood from a time of work to an area in which children would be able to learn and explore the world. But this excluded black children. They were exempted from innocence and were never protected. The 1900 census revealed that about 2 million children were working in mills, mines, fields, factories, and stores, and on city streets throughout the country. The census report boosted a national movement to end childhood labor in the United States, and in 1906, New York teacher Lewis Hine left teaching to photograph child laborers for the National Child Labor Committee, traveling around the country photographing the working conditions of children in all types of industries. And as these photos were published, public support for legal limits on child labor increased. And I have some of the photos here. These are from a National Archives site. Basket sellers, children working in the clothing industry. These girls are making boxes in Florida. This boy is picking berries. The only photo I could find that had any black children was this one from Florida, where these boys are shucking oysters. And this presentation of what children who were being exploited as laborers were helped to influence Congress to eventually pass the Keating-Owen Act in 1917 that banned the sale of products from factories, shops, or canneries that employed children under the age of 14 through interstate commerce. And of course, all of us who took constitutional law know that the Supreme Court overruled this law in the Hammer versus Dagenhart case as being beyond Congress's commerce power. But eventually, in the 1940s, the federal government was able to enact laws protecting child laborers without the interference of the Supreme Court. But these laws exempted agricultural and domestic workers, which is, of course, where black children primarily worked. When I was growing up, my mom would tell me stories about her childhood where she worked as a domestic in St. Louis, and sometimes she would get paid with food, sometimes she'd get paid with stamps, but she was always working in an area where she would never be protected by the law. So this construction of children had a lot of legal input into it, and to connect that to today, I think we need to look at not only the child labor laws that excluded black children, but the general denial of protection of the law that was experienced by black children throughout United States history. Even slavery, of course, included that. But in the post-slavery era, the lynching of children was common. Children were arrested for non-crimes, vagrancy, discretionary crimes, truancy, and were imprisoned for labor. They were also kidnapped for labor, for peonage, and this is described in Slavery by Another Name, the book that came out several years ago that talks about this whole era in which slavery essentially continued. Well, children were victims of that as well. So today, we're in a situation where this exclusion of children from the status of childhood continues. In poor urban neighborhoods throughout the United States, black boys and brown boys routinely have multiple encounters with the police, even though these children have done nothing wrong. They're targeted by police, and they're presumed guilty and suspected by law enforcement of being dangerous or engaged in criminal activity. Brian Stevenson writes about this situation in his new book. And in the 1990s, the media, based on the prediction of a handful of academics, created this portrait of a generation of young people who would be called super predators, young children who were just completely unsocializable and needed to be punished in the severest ways possible. And almost every state increased criminal penalties for children based on the super predator model, which never materialized. Crime rates actually went down for that age cohort in the time where they were predicted to go up. And so you have a number of children who are going to die in prison because they have been sentenced to prison for life without parole. Some states are beginning to draw back from this and look at what they've done, but there are many children, or people who committed crimes as children, who will never get out. So the idea of predation is this negation of the need that children have for love, protection, happiness, and education. And instead of respecting those needs, our culture, the U.S. culture, exploits and preys upon children for profit. Think about how many occupations profit from the discipline and criminalization of black children. When you think of prison guards, there's a whole population of people who have been excluded from the professions that they could follow when we had a more industrialized base. A lot of those people have transferred into the business of guarding prisoners, a number of whom are children. And of course, there's the situations that were discussed this morning on the educational panel of people who are earning their living from pursuing children in a way that does not recognize that we should be doing the opposite. We should be protecting children. And if they're doing things that are outside of our legal rules, we need to try to correct that, but not to punish and make our children outcast. Also consider who profits from the public display and commercialization of black children in sports, in athletics generally. Not only are there the schools, the people who make tremendous amounts of money coaching, selling various supplies, gears, shoes, all pushed at children in terms of having athletic heroes and having them dream of becoming athletes with very, very little chance of that actually occurring. Who profits from the marketing and the sale of nutrient-poor fast food in food deserts throughout the country that make a tremendous amount of their profits from low-income communities of brown and black people? We need to take corporate interests to profit from child poverty. Walmart, where its food stamp receiving employees turn their SNAP benefits, their food stamp benefits, over to their employers at the beginning of every month when they receive their pay, only to run out by the end of the month. McDonald's, Nike, and Coca-Cola need to be called to recognize that children have to be protected and not the source of profits. So we have to make concerted efforts to have our children treated as children as they've never been in U.S. society. When children are harassed by police, we need to go to police stations as a community to demand that black and brown children are given a presumption of innocence that is accorded high school. the things that were mentioned this morning by the panel in terms of education reform need to be taken up in our communities. And of course, if these issues are addressed, it will serve the needs of all children in our society. And I hope that Black and brown communities will be able to work together and in coalition with others to change this culture that preys on children.
So I don't talk particularly loud. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, so I'm Laura Ben from Michigan, and I am, as was said, I'm an economist and a lawyer, legal scholar. Most of my work to date has been in finance, law and finance, but I'm moving in the direction more of international development with focus on Africa and race and the law, as was said. I'm going to talk here, actually the title is a bit not exactly what I'm talking about. What I'm intended to talk about and what I will talk about is the consequences, well, economic inequality and outcomes for African American and Black children in general in the U.S. Some more specific than that title. Usually when we talk about race, I'm talking about legal scholarship, it's talked about separately from economics. There's been an effort to bring them together. But oftentimes race will be talked about, disparities will be talked about as a product of socioeconomic status, and Black children have worse outcomes in various dimensions because they tend to be of lower socioeconomic status. That dodges the race question, but it also dodges the fact that socioeconomic status is not something that's just exists outside of the system. Race has determined wealth because of accumulation of preferences in wealth building and asset building. We have racial wealth inequality, and that's what I'm going to talk about here. My main point is that they should be considered together, not separately. So in recent years, as you probably all know, income inequality and wealth inequality have been increasing, not narrowing. Even though we're in the era of Obama, actually in terms of wealth and income, the disparities between blacks and whites, and here I'm just focusing on blacks and whites, just to keep on the theme, those gaps have actually increased significantly. And if you read the New York Times yesterday, in particular Nicholas Kristof editorial about how to talk, he's been engaging in a series of conversations with white people about race, and he's finding the thing that many of us have found, that it's very hard to talk to white people about race because, well, for a variety of reasons. One, maybe people feel embarrassed or ashamed that they live in a system where, by definition, they are privileged. Maybe they don't want to see that privilege. There's guilt. There's also blaming the victim. So, it's easier to blame a group of people for their situation than it is to say, well, maybe I am in a system that has created their predicament, and not only that, but I actually am privileged. That system privileges me and mine. So in the editorial yesterday, one of the sentences in the editorial was actually stark. He said that wealth inequality in the United States between African Americans and whites right now is actually greater than it was during the time of apartheid in South Africa during the time of apartheid. So it's increasing, not narrowing. We can talk about income inequality, which is often highlighted more than wealth inequality because of the fact that income data are easier to gather. They're more readily available than data on wealth. So the black jobless rate in 2013 was 2 times the white jobless rate, 5.9 for whites versus 11.9 for blacks. That's from BLS data. Median family income gap has also widened over time. So in 2012, the white income per family was $65,880. and for blacks it was 40,797, and that's from census data, that's 2012. And that's just dealing with family income. Home ownership among blacks fell from 1990 to 2010. Blacks during the recession, the recent recession, were more likely to have their homes foreclosed upon them than whites. One of the reasons being that they were more prone to predatory lending, and predatory lending tended to lend to those that were not able to pay back their loans, and it was actually intentional because profits were maximized by lending to more risky borrowers. So homeownership, the rate for blacks is 40%, just above 40%, versus over 70% for whites, homeownership. Now, how does that tie into the question of economic inequality? Well, when you own property, when you own assets, you can borrow against those in the future. You can finance your children's education. It's an asset that will carry over to the future. I have colleagues, for example, when I moved to Ann Arbor for my job, I didn't have a down payment, but I have colleagues that moved into the first-class neighborhoods, not because they've ever had a job in their life, but because their parents had accumulated wealth and assets over time and were able to write them a check so that they could move right into the most prestigious neighborhoods in the community before having ever worked a day in their lives. That's another issue, but we can question whether they have actually started working now. Some people think that academics don't work, so that would be an indictment of me too. So all of these things mean that the wealth gap is widening, and I'll show you. I just have one slide, one picture to illustrate. I can find it. Okay, so at the bottom, the green graph is actually blacks, black non-Hispanic. So I imagine that includes African Americans, but other blacks as well. And you can see that it's pretty flat from 1983 to, this is average family wealth by race and ethnicity. It's pretty flat from 1983 to 2010. There has not been that much movement in black family wealth. Hispanics have progressed, but if you see between 2007 and 2010, there's been a dip. So they've also been also hit by the recession, as has everybody. But at the top, white, non-Hispanic, you can see that it's increased. That wealth has increased secularly over time. How does that happen? Well, if you study finance, then you know that because of the notion of compound interest, if you start in 1983 with greater wealth, that wealth, those assets, build interest, and you accumulate interest on interest on interest on interest. So initial disadvantages can really accumulate over time to create huge disparities. And not only that, it's not like the advantages have disappeared over time. So the advantages accumulate and accumulate, and interest compounds, and it's just a snowball effect. So what does this mean for black children? Well, this is where I've just tried to make the link between economics and the impact on children. This is a new area for me, but some of the obvious things to me appear to be, well, the likelihood that you would grow up in a poor neighborhood. Obviously, the fewer assets that your parents have, the more likely you are to grow up in a poor neighborhood. Poor neighborhoods are criminalized, marginalized, basically outside of the public resources that are available in wealthier neighborhoods. Segregated schools. What does segregated schools mean? They're separate, but they're not equal, so fewer resources per child. I saw a statistic this morning that a 10% increase in the number of non-white children in school is followed by a $75 per pupil decline in expenditures. Incarceration, criminalization within these communities, so that would be correlated with wealth inequality. There is also a general fear of poor people in this country. People have been recently criminalized for giving money or food to the homeless. So that's another added impact of criminalization and marginalization. Obviously, health disparities, educational outcomes. So there's not actually, surprisingly, a lot of empirical research on the link between educational outcomes and wealth inequality. There is obviously with income and educational outcomes, but not wealth and education. But we know that in general, wealth increases the chance of educational success and skills transfer from one generation to the next. So again, I go back to my colleagues just because that's my living reality. But from a very young age, these people, my colleagues, they invest in their children in various ways. They take music lessons, they go do outside sports, they do extracurriculars. It's not enough to take what's given in the school. And even some of these, they go to the top-notch private schools. But even above and beyond that, they are investing in their children. So if you take a child who has none of these resources invested in them and you expect them to compete, well, you know the outcome. So basically, wealth inequality affects opportunities to invest in children. I'll give you another anecdotal story. So I have a colleague who teaches classics and law, and he pointed out last year in an email that he sent to the entire faculty that it's a fact, it's a statistical fact that students who have studied classics in undergrad do better on the LSAT. And he took that as, well, we're just so great in the classics. But I actually thought, and I didn't say it to them, I was debating whether or not to, even recently, but that would be a bit odd to send a response a year later. But my immediate thought was, well, of course, I mean, students who can study the classics are generally well endowed. They come from, I would think, and again, this is just my anecdotal observation based on my undergraduate education, but in general, they come from wealthier backgrounds. They don't need to, they have less of a need to study the practical sciences or economics, the hard, the tangible subjects. They can dilly-dally in classics. And, what are wealthier children able to do? They're able to take LSAT preparation courses or GRE preparation courses. So in my mind, I thought, well, yeah, of course those that studied classics on average do better. But it's not, in my opinion, necessarily because they're inherently smarter, but because there's a high degree of correlation between wealth and studying classics and taking these college preparation or graduate school preparation courses. So racial disparities in schools start very young. At the age of 2 years old, the gap starts to widen, and it only increases from there. So I have a few more minutes. I think that there needs to be more rigorous research into the connection between economic inequality and child development. And in particular, I think, in addition to the data and statistical analyses, I think we need to understand more the role of the law in creating wealth inequality. So what is it about the financial laws, about the tax code, about lending laws? What is it about them that enabled these wealth gaps to be created in the first place and to still persist? And yeah, that's my main point, that I think that we can benefit from understanding the interactions between race and wealth and not treat them as separate and independent categories. Thank you.
All right, good morning. I'm Professor Nikki Booth Perry from Florida A&M University. I said Florida in Orlando. It's not 20 degrees or whatever crazy weather you all are having here. But nevertheless, I am thrilled to be here. I'm honored to be here. I still thank the Dean for supporting this. And I thank Anthony, not just for inviting me, but as you heard from my introduction, I'm an ethics and professionalism person. And that's what I've been doing pretty much all my tenure in academia. And I just got into talking about social media as it related to professionalism and ethics. And so when Anthony contacted me about this particular conference, it made me think about that connection to our black children, and being a mother of 3 black children. It's very important to me personally also. So I thank you not just for the invite, but for, provoking my mind here. So all right, so I have, for somebody who this is not my area per se, I have 30 slides that I came up with. And so I know that Professor Price is going to hold me to my time. So I did the math and I said I have 10 minutes and I have to do 3 slides per minute. But then if I start, if I do a little introduction, then I have 9 minutes, and do the math. I can't do the math. So I'm probably going to fly through some of the slides. Most of them are statistical things that I'll show you, and some background, which most of you should be familiar with anyway. So if you need information afterwards, I'd be happy to share with you. All right, so my topic today is freedom from fear. It's how social media is impacting and influencing the development and safety of our children. So if you have been alive at least since 1980, everybody here, at least since 1980, you have a digital footprint, right? So here is the definition of what a digital footprint is. You can look at that. It can be passive or it can be active. So active is when you actually create data that you're deliberately, as the user, sharing information. But a lot of the passive data is created when data is collected without you knowing. So when you're doing other things, data is being collected about you. You go to the doctor, you go to, a lawyer's office, you go to school, your education. Data is being collected on you, and your digital footprint is being created. One of the largest pieces of the digital footprint is social media. Here is the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of social media. But generally, social media is any social interaction via technological means, right? So not just your cell phones, computers, any technological means would include social media. So here are some of the more common social media. I think it might be common to you. Some of them you might not even know, which is going to be part of my presentation, why you need to know some of these things. Does anybody know what the little yellow person in the little ghost in the yellow thing is? That is Snapchat, which is starting to be one of the most frequently used applications by our teenagers, right? And then you've got Vine, and then Kik. You know what Kik is? All right, Kik is also getting to be very important in the study of predators on our children. A lot of children using Kik. It's a kind of text messaging type of situation. I'll tell you a little bit more about Snapchat as we go ahead. Here is just some data on, and this is as of November of last year, so it may have very well changed. This is a year ago, but you can see the big 9. Do we even know what the big 9 are? Facebook, YouTube, Google+. You know what that little cloud is? SoundCloud. You know what the little bird is. All right, Twitter. Most of us should know the N. LinkedIn. Come on. Instagram, Pinterest, and Tumblr. All right, so here is just kind of a landscape of social media users. This is also a 2012 study done by the Pew Research Center, and they were looking at which one of the social media categories are more appealing to different categories of people. And you can see Twitter and Instagram seem to be more appealing to African Americans, but there are also a significant number of course, with women, Facebook is still our big social networking site. Here is usage by gender, education, income, and interestingly, they threw in urban, suburban, and rural. Thought that was interesting. And again, this is more of the adults. They're giving you the ages, so I'm going to skip through these. And this is the one that's most important for teens, which is why if you have kids, you should know what some of those signs are. So Facebook's still the big one, Twitter, Instagram, Google+. Tumblr, Pinterest, not so much, and the other ones that are probably, of course, no LinkedIn there for the teenagers. Now, this was interesting. So this is the use of social media by age group. So look at the 6 to 8-year-olds. 6 to 8-year-olds. Facebook actually has a minimum age restriction of 13 years old to create an account. There was a study that was done by Consumer Reports that said last year 78% of parents helped create their children's Facebook pages, regardless of their age, and 7.5 million users are under the age of 13 and admitted to lying about their age so that they could get a Facebook account. So we've got lots of kids on these social media websites, with 52% of 8 to 16-year-olds admitted that they ignored the official age limits. There are other popular websites that they use. Interestingly, the poll found that 21% of children had posted negative comments starting from an average age of 11. 26% had hijacked another person's account and posted without permission. Some 43% had messaged strangers, starting from the average age of 12, right? The study suggests that children are more likely to post an image or video of themselves online or set up a fake profile for the first time at the age of 11, try Twitter and message a stranger at 12, and then try other services like Snapchat at about the age of 13. All right. Here is a look of the, active users of the top 10 social platforms by age. As you can see, that 16 to 24 category is the bright pink. And on all of the social platforms, they outnumber everybody else that's using these social platforms. So our children are on social networking sites. They're creating huge digital footprints with their use of social media. So, of course, social media, there are lots of pros to social media, right? So back in my day, we had to go find the Encyclopedia Britannica. Do we know what that is? Some of us. Some of you can relate. But now there's Google. There are all types of search information for children. So wonderful. There is rapid dissemination and acquisition of information. They can, have vast consumption of content in a very short span of time. And then the wonderful thing about connecting with families and friends, the whole networking, it's amazing how our great world has seemed so much smaller now because of social media. So that's wonderful. The opportunity to have real-time communication and, ongoing dialogue is amazing. And more interestingly, there have been some recent studies about using social media as a tool for facilitating civic engagement and collective action. And I did a small talk at a school about how social media helps to galvanize the communities for the Ferguson protests, right? Street protests are not new. They've always been in part of our history and our democracy. But in order to galvanize the community like we are able to do now with social media, you send a tweet, you post it on Facebook, everybody come out, everybody do this. We had these wonderful campaigns. I think it was hashtag if they gunned me down. I don't know if you remember that. Somebody spoke this morning, I believe it was Francis, about the portrayal of our black children and black society in the media. And social media was so instrumental in showing that disparity. There were reports when they had the Ferguson protests, and I'll read the language that the mainstream reporter said they used non-lethal rounds were used to dispense the protesters. That was what was initially was reported. And then we see on social media the actual bloody pictures and videos that people are able to post. We're able to see, the pepper balls and wooden pellets and the bloody wounds that they caused. And you're seeing that there's clearly a disparity, whether people believed it or not. Many of us knew for years. But that difference, that interplay between social media and traditional media is very stark. So yes, we have that opportunity now to get, real-time dialogue, real-time stories, actually what's really happening from people who are on the scene, on the floor, right there, then and there. So wonderful, all types of different pros to social media. The hashtag If I Were Gunned Down campaign, they had teenagers, well, not only teenagers, lots of people across the country posting pictures of themselves in a screenshot. So you'd have your picture of, your high school graduation or your college graduation, your cap and gown, or, in your business attire on one side. And then on the other side, you in your casual attire, or maybe saying, hey, peace, or, is that a gang sign? And the theory was, if I were gunned down, which picture would the media put up? Would they put up my wonderful, professional-looking picture, or would they put up my other picture with my, sagging jeans or my casual outfit or whatever it is, to portray who I am again? And so that was also one of the contrasts that reminded me, I thought about it when Francis was speaking, about how we are portrayed in the media. So in addition to the pros, there are some cons, and I want to specifically I'll tell you generally about some cons and then how it specifically relates to our youth. So social media claims to be, content agnostic. So, this deliberate ignorance. You can post whatever you want to post. We're not going to monitor what you do. So there's a problem with that, particularly when we talk about young people and them posting what they want to post, or other people posting what they want to post, and it being our young people being exposed to that. There are privacy issues, which I'll touch on real quickly. And then there's a concern about the decreased or altered social skills. And last night I had a conversation with our luncheon speaker, and she was telling me about actual neurological scientific research that shows the physiological changes in the brain when you're so exposed to all this technology. So there's some science to back up the concern regarding the altered social skills. And of course, particularly if you're a professor, I don't know, over the years I've recognized the difference in the grammar, even the way students email me. This stunted vocabulary that we are living in? You know what BTW is?
By the way.
All right, everybody. By the way, do you know what AFAIK is? Okay, TYT, LMK when you're done. Take your time, let me know. It's TYT, LMK. And what's AFAIK? See, as far as I know. See, you got to know these things. As far as I know. Right. All right. So let's talk about some of the cons. There is, there's online, you can go and you can find like a dictionary of, shorthand, text and shorthand. So some specific cons for our youth. Of course, the exposure to inappropriate content, right? Might expose them to content, people, or situations that are way out of their depth in which they are completely unemotionally or they're emotionally not prepared for. And then we talked about the effect of interpersonal communication skills. There's also the problem of psychological impact. You've heard of Facebook depression? Yeah, Facebook depression. There's some studies that indicate that the more time spent viewing other people's lives actually increases feelings of depression. They also have what's known as the fear of missing out. And it's been defined as being marked by the feelings of inadequacy someone experiences when they see members of their social circles posting photos of fabulous vacations, expensive purchases, and even adorable children. Feelings of jealousy and resentment often pervade when observing the positive things in others' lives. So we've got some psychological impact, which may very well be related to those physiological changes that are being evidenced on scientific studies. And then there are some other very important consequences. There are legal consequences. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about sexting. And then, of course, Marjolaine just talked about this whole notion of predation. So we've got the predator situation also. That's a huge danger for our young people. And then the bullying and the cyberbullying, which could in and of itself be a whole presentation. So I'll just briefly touch on that also. All right, so on privacy real quick. I don't know if you're aware, but when you upload a photo to a social media site, from a smartphone, they have location information embedded in there. So someone who is tech savvy can actually upload a photo and they can tell you exactly where you are. They can find you that way, right? So your privacy is a lot. This in and of itself could be a presentation about the lack of privacy that our society is now undergoing, but certainly partially it is in part due to social media. Then there's the viability of information, information that is going to last. And then there's the issue of sexting. Recent study done at Drexel University. These are the percentages of minors who are sexting. And just in case you don't know, sexting is the act of sending sexually explicit messages, primarily between mobile phones. So here's the study which was done of some undergraduate students, and they were asking them about their experiences as undergraduates and prior to their undergraduate career, so high school, middle school, and so forth, and whether they sexted. So this was a study. More than half of them reported sexting as minors. 28% were photographic text. I want to come back and talk about the 61 and 59%. 71% reported knowing other teens who experienced negative consequences. Look at the amount of students, the percentage that notified anybody when they received a text, because I'm sure they're not notifying you when they send the text sext. 2% reported it. 2%. So they're receiving these things and they're not letting the adults know. What is interesting with this study is it said that only 59% of the respondents reported that knowledge of legal consequences would have or probably would have deterred them from sexting. Now that is important because there are huge ramifications for sexting. Because we don't have any specific federal laws on sexting, when there are sexting cases, what the courts are doing is they're prosecuting them under child pornography laws. And as we know, child pornography laws carry with them very, very strict penalties, jail time. It could be very, very life-changing experience for a young person who thinks they're just sending a little nasty text, and then they're being prosecuted under child pornography laws. And as we know from statistics, who is going to be disparately impacted by any changes that are going to result in incarceration of our youth, and it's predominantly going to be our minority children. All right? Another thing that our children might not be aware of that could have implications is, the whole viability of the information. There's long-term consequences. Thank you. Oh, I'm out of time. Am I out of time? Yes. I'm out of time. All right, so I'll just flash through. All right, so The information isn't viable. Let's just say that. Nothing's ever, deleted from a server. Sexual solicitation, this is where the sexual solicitation is occurring nowadays, online, right? They're using social media to find your kids, invite your kids out. Young kids are agreeing to meet people. Cyberbullying, we've got laws for bullying that don't really extend out of the school grounds. So they're not really sure what to do with cyberbullying, and they're prosecuting them under harassment cases. And again, there's an issue with high academic minority students, what did you call it? Being smart while black? Yeah, and showing that they're at a higher rate of prevalence to be bullied because they are, and then of course we know that bullying leads to other things that, they miss school and it affects their education and so on. It's just an ongoing situation. There's some existing laws that I feel we could use to create some more streamlined laws that children will understand, that parents will understand. We need some educational initiatives. These are some of the laws that are there that we can use. And we just really have to recognize that in our day and age today, our children, our young people are living in a completely different society than we were. We like to say, you didn't have it the way I did. Well, we didn't have it the way they did. And we really need to, as adults, be very aware of, keep this conversation going because it's affecting our youth, particularly our minority youth, and to make sure that we are committed to be engaged with what's going on with social media and technology. Thank you, and thank you for the attention.
Hello?
Hello.
Hi. That was wonderful. I just say I am so glad I was born before Mark Zuckerberg and didn't grow up with all of that. All right. Thank you. It's an honor to be here today. I want to thank Anthony Farley in particular for inviting me to participate, which is such esteemed colleagues. Hello, everyone. My name is Maggie Ellinger-Locke. I'm a native of St. Louis, Missouri, and a practicing attorney in the St. Louis area. I'd like to discuss how the St. Louis County municipal court system has made #Ferguson inevitable. So you probably know the basic facts. Like the rest of the country, St. Louis has a race problem. On August 9th of this year, 18-year-old Michael Brown was shot and killed by Officer Darren Wilson outside of the Canfield Green apartment complex in the center of Ferguson, Missouri, launching months of protests. Since then, a question has been raised by activists and scholars alike. Why Michael Brown? Why Ferguson? Why this killing when there are scores of young men of color gunned down by white police officers across this country all of the time? To start, let's go back to 1861 and the Great Divorce. This took place when, through voter referendum, the city of St. Louis split from the county. The motivation for this split concerned taxes. At the time, the city was large and affluent and the county tiny, rural, and poor. City residents didn't want to have to carry the burden of the county, and no one at the time believed that the county would grow to be 3 times the size of the city, as is the case today. Efforts at reunification have never proven successful, and the divorce didn't stop in 1861. The county became more and more fractured over time, often a result of white affluent residents establishing restrictive covenants to keep their neighbors of color outside of the newly established borders. This fracturing of communities eventually led to the system in existence today, whereby we have 90 municipalities ranging in population from over 50,000 to only 12. Each has its own municipal code, its own police force, and 81 have their own court system. For lawyers, that means lots and lots of night court. For defendants, of course, it means much more. In each and every one of these municipalities, the police are disproportionately white and the defendants are disproportionately black. Often these percentages are not just disproportional, but overwhelming. African Americans are 63% more likely to be pulled over while driving in the state of Missouri than whites. Once stopped, blacks are almost twice as likely to be searched and twice as likely to be arrested. This is despite the fact that searches of whites are 15% more likely to produce contraband. In the state of Missouri, if you're alleged to have broken a state statute, you are sent to appear in circuit court. If you're alleged to have violated a municipal ordinance, you are summoned to appear in municipal court, also known as muni court or night court. The vast majority of people charged with anything in the St. Louis area face their charges in muni court. When defendants are charged with a municipal ordinance violation, they are usually sentenced to pay a fine to the court. If they cannot pay this fine, they are ordered to return to court at a later date to make the payment. Should they miss any future court date, the court issues a bench warrant for their failure to appear. These failure to appear warrants build up and over time can result in thousands of dollars being owed to the court by each individual defendant per charge. Should the defendant face ordinance violation charges in multiple municipalities, they can end up being picked up by the police and transferred from jail to jail, often spending weeks or longer locked up over what effectively amounts to a traffic ticket, including the failure to disperse charges protesters are facing in Ferguson. Lawyers refer to this situation as the muni shuffle, that is, shuffling from one tiny jail to another. This is the combination of racism and money, capitalism and white supremacy. The city of Ferguson has 21,000 residents and about 8,000 households. 2/3 of all Ferguson residents are African American, and almost 3/4 of all residents live below the poverty line. Despite such poverty, last year, the Ferguson Municipal Court took in a staggering $2.6 million, the second largest source of revenue for the city. And the source of this revenue stream? Last year, Ferguson issued almost 25,000 warrants, an astonishing 3 for every household. However, the laser focus on Ferguson over the past few months has been misplaced. Had Michael Brown been killed a few blocks to the north, we would not be talking about Ferguson, but rather the city of Delwood. Had his death taken place a few blocks to the south, we would be talking about Jennings. For this is not a Ferguson issue. Ferguson may be the hashtag, but this is a St. Louis epidemic. The police have claimed open season on young men of color, both economically and physically, and the ongoing rebellion taking place in the St. Louis area is a direct response. But why the response? What sets apart St. Louis from the rest of the nation is our incredibly unique municipal court system. It's unlike anywhere else in the country, unlike anywhere else even in our own state. Indeed, it is the St. Louis County system of debtors' prisons and the racism driving them that creates the situations like the one that killed Michael Brown. The Ferguson Rebellion is a direct response to this racist and I would argue unconstitutional practice of debtors' prisons that make up the St. Louis County municipal court system. So let's concretize this some more. Say you are charged with speeding. You have a couple of options. The first is to simply pay the fine. Because Missouri driver's licenses operate on a point system, using this method will cause points to be assessed on your license and your insurance rates will go up. Accumulate enough points, you lose your license altogether. The second choice is to hire local counsel who agrees to enter her appearance on your behalf and obtain a recommendation from the prosecuting attorney to dispose of the ticket for a sum of money plus court costs greater than the original fine. You pay for an attorney and the higher cost of the amended ticket, but you avoid the points and the consequent insurance policy penalties. Option 2 is your best choice, assuming you can afford the upfront costs. Option 3 requires you to appear in court yourself. You show up in court on the night in question. Hopefully you've been able to get off work and find someone to watch your kids. In most munis, children are not permitted in the courtroom, which is a matter currently under examination. And you wait for the judge to call your name. You appear in front of the judge and enter a plea. If you enter a plea of not guilty, the judge will continue your case to the next trial night, and you will have to return to court and fight the ticket. Should you enter a plea of guilty, the judge will sentence you to pay the original fine amount plus court costs. If you cannot afford to pay on that evening, you enter into a payment plan with the court. Payment plans vary from court to court, but all require at least a $50 payment per month. If you cannot afford this amount, you must explain why to the judge in front of everyone in the courtroom, and the judge will inquire as to your finances. This can be humiliating. Defendants are regularly told to call everyone they know to come up with the sums owed or risk jail time. A defendant who cannot afford to make the payment plan will have to return month after month to request more time from his or her honor. This will make the judge impatient. Eventually, most people will miss a court date, and a bench warrant will be issued. Oftentimes, an individual can end up incarcerated dozens of times over the same municipal charge. Thus, a traffic ticket, which is ostensibly a civil matter, becomes a criminal one. Should you be arrested on this new warrant, you're likely to sit in jail for an extended period of time. No municipality has court on a daily basis. Indeed, many only meet once per month. Thus, if you are arrested, you will spend time at the city's expense in jail awaiting your court date, sometimes for almost an entire month waiting to see the judge. Note that defendants are not provided with counsel in these municipalities. By statute, public defenders cannot represent these individuals. Defendants are regularly sentenced to fines and probation without the benefit of counsel. Probation generally comes with heavy costs to be paid by the defendant to private companies providing probation services. These companies work closely with the court system, and should a defendant miss a payment, they notify the prosecuting attorney, who files a motion to revoke their probation. Note that every step along the way, the defendant's tab to the court grows regardless of ability to pay. Under Missouri law, both case law and by statute, defendants are technically entitled to a hearing on ability to pay, but these are extremely rare in practice. Indeed, I have never seen one actually held. In preparation for this presentation, I reached out to many fellow criminal defense attorneys in the St. Louis area and could not find anyone else who had ever even encountered such a hearing. Thus, defendants are regularly incarcerated for their poverty. Practicing in the St. Louis County Municipal Court system is practicing poverty law by another name. Another unique feature of this municipal court system is that both judges and prosecutors are private attorneys in practice elsewhere. Because these positions are part-time, they need not reside in the municipality and can serve multiple jurisdictions. A municipal judge may be a full-time state prosecutor as her day job. For example, Ron Brockmeyer is a prosecuting attorney for the city of Ferguson, the judge in the nearby city of Florissant, and a private defense attorney in St. Charles County. This is run-of-the-mill practice in the St. Louis area. Another important feature of this system is that the amount collected through the muni courts is inversely proportional to the wealth of the community. For example, the city of Pine Lawn is 96% black with a per capita income of $13,000 per year. In 2013, it collected over $1.7 million. Oh my God. Compare this to the affluent suburb of Chesterfield with a population of 47,000, roughly 15 times bigger than Pine Lawn, and a per capita income of $50,000, which collected only $1.2 million, less than Pine Lawn by over $500,000. Thus, the more affluent the municipality, the less dependent it is on fine collection. When cities use the threat of jail to collect outstanding fines from its residents, they are no longer providing community services, but are instead preying off the poor. When basically everyone in your community has a warrant out for their arrest, the courts and the police are able to inflict a constant low-level harassment involving traffic stops, court appearances, high fines, and the threat of jail for failure to pay without inquiry into ability to pay. And sometimes these stops rise above and beyond low-level harassment. And that is when you have killings, such as what happened to Michael Brown. The overwhelming majority of St. Louis area residents experience the judicial system through the municipal courts. This public impression of the overall system is shaped there more than in any other venue. The current policies by the municipal courts leave one with the impression that the cities are racist institutions that care more about generating revenue than dispensing justice. The costs of running such a system are not cheap, and the vast bulk of the costs are eaten up by court officials' salaries. In Bell Ridge, that's $18,600 for the judge and $25,000 for the prosecutor. By way of comparison, public defenders in Missouri start out making $38,533 annually. Note that the judge and the prosecutor work only 3 evenings per month, or just 12 hours a month. They also, of course, run their own private legal practices. Put another way then, the Bell Ridge prosecuting attorney job requires only 7.5% of the time of a full-time job, but makes about 65% as much as an assistant public defender. That's $129.17 per hour for the judge and $173.61 per hour for the prosecuting attorney. I did the math. In Bell Ridge, like most St. Louis County municipalities, the prosecutor and the judge are not chosen by constituents, but are hand-selected by the village trustees. Implicit in their job duties is that they must find enough money through imposed fines to fund their salaries. Thus, the people who occupy these roles are incentivized not to dispense justice, but to generate revenue. Taken as a whole, then, the practices I've described raise many concerns. They violate both the U.S. and Missouri state constitutions. They destroy the public's faith in the judicial system. They impose heavy fines on the most burdened sector of the population. They cost the municipalities themselves, as well as everyone involved with this system, a tremendous amount in both human and monetary capital. Plus, they're tremendously racist. The effect of all these policies is to push the poor deeper and deeper into poverty, making it a crime to be poor. Debtors' prisons are alive and well in the St. Louis area, and people are being targeted not because of their income or lack thereof, but because of their skin color. The Justice for Mike Brown movement represents the most exciting, creative, and potentially radical change this area has seen in a very long time. Locally, I work with a group of attorneys who are actively targeting this municipal court system in an effort to, at the very least, reform it, if not bring it down altogether. Close to 400 individual arrests have taken place at the municipal level since August 9th, and we are developing and implementing strategies to effect change in this system. For example, under Supreme Court operating rules, we are entitled to jury trial for municipal defendants. One needs to try and lose a case on the bench level, then timely post a bond and demand a trial de novo. Yet for long before I entered practice, defendants are routinely denied this constitutionally protected right. If we can regain our right to jury trials for these #Ferguson protesters, we can demand them on behalf of each protester who's interested and challenge the system by putting the kind of stress on it that it puts on its victims. This is one way to rebalance the power. We can take the time out to pick a jury and try these cases, and that is a far more difficult task for the muni prosecutors. One sec, almost done. Another thing the movement has done is issue demands that include municipal court reform, specifically demanding inquiry into a person's ability to pay assessed fines prior to incarceration, or even demanding community service as an alternative to fines, something the vast majority of the courts currently do not offer. The young, primarily African-American protesters are crying out for such logical and appropriate reform, and with their leadership, we might actually achieve it. This movement, its power, will change this municipal court system. It's a matter of life and death for these protesters, so of course they will not give up the struggle. I just hope that myself and my fellow local legal practitioners can keep up. Thank you.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be with you today, and if you give me just a moment to set up. I had my laptop plugged in here only to find out that it wasn't charging at all. So all right. My paper deals with the following topic, and that is how for children of incarcerated parents, their fate is worse than having a parent who has died or has been divorced, which is pretty profound when you think about the incarceration rates that have been talked about. And how do I get here? Much of my work deals with the intersection of law and medicine, and I want to take a moment to just flag what I find to be a pretty interesting point maybe to start us off. And then I want to talk about women and motherhood as being a key feature. Much of what we talk about when it relates to the school to prison pipeline, or when we talk about issues of incarceration, happen to focus on men. Oftentimes it leaves out women, although it's really worth noting that today in the United States, the incarceration rate associated with drug-related offenses, women are arrested at a higher rate than men and prosecuted at a higher rate than men. Equally in the United States, if you read Forbes et al., a really interesting article appeared this weekend with an infographic that in the United States there are more women in prison than in China and Russia combined. We have more women in prison in the United States than any other country in the world. Who are these women? They are poor and they are women of color. So it's a mistake, I think, when we don't put that central in some of our discussion. Now, the reason why health matters in some of the ways that we don't even necessarily anticipate it, here's a story for you. In 2013, 15-year-old Anthony Stokes was told that he had less than 6 months to live. Some of you may remember this story. He was a person whose heart was failing. Doctors at the Children's Health Care Center of Atlanta, where the teenager was being treated, told his mother that he was going to die and that he needed a heart. Now, for many people, the logical next step would be, well, place him on the transplant wait list. He's 15 years old and he needs a heart. This is the thing that happens. They wrote the mother a letter explaining why they would not do that, and they said because he has bad grades and because he's had suspensions in the past. Oh my God. Now that gives you a whole different perspective about how the crisis of black childhood. Since when does a suspension or having bad grades means that it's literally a death sentence? And in fact, what was also stunning about that is that they're so bold. It's not like they whispered it to her. They put it on their letterhead and sent her a letter in the mail. They said that they were concerned that he would be non-compliant with his treatment if they were to put him on a wait list and he were to get a heart, because of course a heart is a precious and valuable commodity and should only go to people who happen to be worthwhile. That is the interpretation. After protest and some activism online, the hospital rescinded that and placed him on a wait list. All right. But that gives us a bit of an open door to think about the crisis that happens to be at hand and how what happens at the school level may in fact influence what happens at the level of health. I wanted to initially contextualize some early childhood movements, but that was done so brilliantly by our other panelists that I'll just dive in very quickly to talk about fetal protection laws and the irony of punishment that goes along with that. So there's been a movement in the United States that purports to want to address childhood health and safety, and that's been the movement to protect fetuses. And legislators have claimed that it is because there's such an incredible expense at our neonate wards at hospitals that, in fact, our attention should be on fetuses. And that might make sense, except it's often not supported empirically. What we have seen is that neonate units happen to be the most profitable of all hospital units now, but it's not because we're saving black babies. It has been driven up by assisted reproductive technology and people who are using very sophisticated technologies to have children. Some of you, well, when I was growing up, I was absolutely fascinated by twins and triplets. And in fact, it made the news when people, in fact, birth twins and triplets. Why doesn't that happen anymore? Because assisted reproductive technology has in fact become such demand, and with that we've seen more than 1,000-fold increase in the gestation of multiple fetuses at one time, that triplets are no longer fascinating. In fact, it has to be 5 or 6 children being gestated at once in order to make the news. But this has significant health implications, of course, because all of those babies will be born premature. And in the average cases involving multiple births, let's say 5 children being born at one time, it involves hundreds, around 100, so we're talking about dozens of medical personnel being involved. So when states say we need to get involved in these issues and we need to track the pregnancies of poor women of color because they're the ones who are contributing to these high neonate costs, they get it wrong. It's not them. But it turns out that there's some very significant criminal law impacts from that concern that don't trickle to those who are using assisted reproductive technology, and I would not suggest that it should, because I think that the criminal law force of the state shouldn't be engaged in women's pregnancies. But let me give you a little bit of a backdrop with this and then quickly move forward given time. 2 movements came together in the 1980s, U.S. drug war and also the war on women through welfare. And this started, it gave a kind of legitimacy to fetal protection laws. Basically, what we were looking to do is to stamp out what had been euphemistically called the crack baby and their mothers. But what's very interesting in terms of the state effort to get at the crack mother and to prevent their crack babies from swamping us was that we were missing so many things that empirically could be tracked that took place in these women's lives and how they lived. For example, there are many different factors that could influence states' chief concerns about fetal birth and weight, etc., including poverty, pesticides, carcinogens, and lead. Many of us know that those who live closest to the most toxic sites in any given locale happen to be poor people, and they are overwhelmingly people of color. Now, fetal health is, in fact, a very complex and nuanced issue, and I think it should be looked at within that particular context. But what was quite problematic with thinking about crack babies as being the source of harm for the United States is that it just simply got so much incredibly wrong. In fact, Dr. Claire Coles and Dr. Hiram Hell, two researchers who had spent their entire careers focusing on the interplay between drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, and fetuses, for years had research that reporters just simply did not want to pick up on because it didn't support the narrative that was very popular in the media. In fact, there were headlines, New York Times, Washington Post, that verbatim said that crack babies were better off dead. It reported that these were children that had misshaped genitalia, that they had brains that were smaller than the average brain, that they would never be educable people. But what's fascinating is that the research from Dr. Claire Coles and also Dr. Hiram Hell exposed that there was no such thing as a crack baby at all. In fact, poverty is a better indicator about how well a child will do in life. And these studies that they conducted, particularly Dr. Hiram Hell's work, was not about the occasional user of crack. And I'm not suggesting that anybody should use crack at all. It is not candy. It's not. But it turns out exactly what became a political agenda that was very useful for politicians to get elected turned out to be just incredibly wrong. The people who were involved in her study were people who were seriously addicted to crack cocaine. And what she found after tracking them and their children, the study lasted more than 2 decades, is that we couldn't discover what a kind of crack baby was. We couldn't. In fact, the Journal of the American Medical Association and the New England Journal of Medicine in the early 2000s disavowed the term and said they would no longer publish any articles that used that term. Last year online, not in print, the New York Times also did a retreat from its reporting in the 1980s and the 1990s, calling on the carpet Dr. Ira Chasnoff, who was the first person to indicate that there was something called a crack baby. Now, his career benefited mightily from this, but it's worth noting what his initial study actually was, what his initial study was and how it was put together. There was no control group. It only involved 23 babies. So a whole movement and political agenda that kicked kids out of schools, that incarcerated their mothers, was all based on 23 babies. Now, what Dr. Claire Coles will tell us from her research is that much of the imagery that we saw on the news in the 1980s and 90s were not even babies that had been exposed to crack. Typically what newspaper reporters would do, and also night news reporters with their cameramen, would go into the wards that had premature babies. And it was the premature babies that were shaking, right? But what's interesting in terms of their rhetoric about the crack babies and their mothers is what they said about these children. They said about how they didn't like to make eye contact with their mother, that they brought us, quote, into a brave new world where kids were incredibly damaged by cocaine. In fact, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists wrote that these crack babies were a, quote, bio-underclass, a generation of physically damaged babies whose biological inferiority is stamped at birth. And on from there. And you can imagine then what this means for all of those who then come into contact with these children and what our expectations were. In fact, the president at Boston University in the 1980s said that these would be children who would never be educable, would never be able to attend fine schools like Boston University. Now, I only have a couple minutes left before I close, but I also want us to think about why it is that we selectively target in those babies that we want to save, and we only want to save them when they're in the womb and not when they leave the womb, which brings me to 2 points. One, I will just put in the air and we can perhaps think about it, and that is the regulations of cigarettes and tobacco. In the case that went before the U.S. Supreme Court, Food and Drug Administration v. Brown and William Tobacco Corporation, was very interesting to note how the Supreme Court, in a majority opinion, said that the Food and Drug Administration could not regulate tobacco. Now, what's fascinating about this, as the minority of the court pointed out, was that the deaths that are associated with tobacco exceed all of the categories that we could combine: air crashes, road crashes, cancers. All of that comes from cigarettes, and no regulation there. And as the dissenting opinion says in that case, largely that's an economic decision by Congress. What I'm going to leave you with is the final, and that is, where else does our pipeline go? Is it just to prison? Well, it turns out before prison, our pipeline goes elsewhere, and that elsewhere, and I will close up, happens to be foster care. And I want to just flag to you what that means for our children who are in foster care, which is no longer temporary, but it's a system that children age out of. We have over 500,000 kids in foster care. Overwhelmingly, they are children of color. The largest minority group happens to be African Americans, followed by Latinos. And here's what an empirical study done by the University of Chicago that has tracked kids for more than a decade, here's what they know: that when these children age out of foster care, less than half are employed. Homelessness, about 25% have been homeless when they leave foster care. Pregnancy, more than 75% of young women had been pregnant since leaving foster care. Convicted of crime, nearly 60% of young men had been convicted of a crime, and more than 80% had been arrested. Uneducated, only 6% had a 2 to 4 year degree. Now, I'm going to close with that, because as we think about what these pipelines represent, prison is one, but the other happens to be when we incarcerate their mothers and we don't pay attention to that, there's another pipeline, and that's foster care, and it's just as pernicious and dangerous for the livelihoods of those children. And I thank you and the organizers.
Questions? Comments? Yes. My question first. Thanks so much for your presentation on social media. I wonder if you have any interest in looking into the ways in which Black parents have been increasingly using social media to instill fear in their children. There are sites like World Star Hip Hop and even Facebook where you see these videos of parents who record themselves looking at children or shaking their heads because they look like clowns, or my child wanted to act grown, so they shake their heads with their voice to make them look like grown men. And they, put these videos online, and then there's a whole commentary that follows. People say, oh, we need more Black fathers like this, more mothers like this. These kids today are so bad, they're out of line. There were a few viral videos. One of the fathers raised porn to lift his daughter with an extension cord. There was the uncle who shaved his child. There was a boy who had joined the gang, and his uncle raped him.
Right.
And in order to try to save him, but he ended up dead less than a year later. So I wonder if more questions. Oh, sorry. So I wonder if you think about looking at that and the interaction and use of these videos when they get into the hands of law enforcement and prosecutors, putting these parents in problem.
So twofold. Ooh, that mic is loud. Okay. So the question is basically about the use of those videos depicting the parents disciplining their children and how it's basically going to impact society and prosecutions, and from the side of the children also. So I don't know of any particular studies about that, but I can say anecdotally that it definitely is having an impact, especially on our children. And one of the things, I don't think it's instilling fear in the children. And again, I can only speak anecdotally from being very involved in the school system. What it's doing is it's desensitizing our children to corporal punishment. So it's not helping the situation if that's the way you think that children should be disciplined. And you and I did speak about, the physiological effects of corporal punishment. So what it should do is educate the parents to say, look, you're showing these kids that you're beating this other child. The other kids are laughing about it. They don't care about that. That's not how you're going to change their behavior. Now, having the evidence for prosecution purposes, child abuse is child abuse. So if it is risen to the level of child abuse in that state and there is direct evidence that's online, the prosecutor's free to use that. And I don't think they should be stymied in that account. I think it really just goes back, though, to the whole education of the parents and the children. And it's not recognizing that corporal punishment, I know Reggie and I talked about corporal punishment not really being the answer, even though it's so culturally embedded for us in the African American community. It's really not the answer.
Well, this is a quick comment. This conference originally began as a conference against corporal punishment. Right? So that to try to see how we can bring this country forward to be like other countries like Sweden, for example, where it is against the law to take a child. So parents cannot take children. Children are informed that parents, teachers, other caretakers are not allowed to take them without breaking the law, and no one does it. Sweden banned it in 1979. They have a quite diverse population. 20% of Swedes are born outside of Sweden. They're a great working model for how society can get along without incorporating violence and then euphemism in the regular care of children. And so that's how this conference actually began. I view all the conference as a way of highlighting that fact.
There's no problem. Go ahead. From Michelle. Do you see any kind of parallel demonization or criminalization of meth addicted babies?
I want to repeat that, and I'm not sure where our microphone is. So the question is there, are we on? Okay, well, we're doing our best to be tuned into those who are
I'll take it.
Thank you. So the question that's been posed is there a comparative to those who use meth and criminalization? So what's interesting is that poverty tracks this. More recently, there has been the effort to incarcerate women who suffer from meth, not everywhere. For years, this was just about black women and the use of illicit drugs. And in the state of Alabama, over the last 2 years, there have been more than 100 arrests of poor women, most of them who happen to be white. Many of them have, in fact, all of them have taken plea deals. None of them have actually had their cases go before a jury. And some of these plea deals are years in jail. And so that's quite stunning, but that also could be placed into context with the eugenics movement in the United States prior to Nazi Germany having a eugenics law. We had one in the United States. In fact, they borrowed from our eugenics law in the United States, which was found to be constitutional by the Supreme Court in 1927. And our eugenics law provided that people who were considered socially or morally unfit could be forcibly sterilized by the state. And the test case that came before the court involved a very poor white girl from Virginia who had been raped. And Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So this issue about poverty itself is one that's very important to take note of here. And also I appreciate the question with regard to meth. I'll add on one very quick piece, is that there's also an irony in terms of how we police too and the selective nature of this. And here's why. Over the last 30 or 35 years, there's been a study that tracks maternity and the use of prescription medications. You might imagine what it's found, which is that there's a dramatically high increase between when the study first began and now in terms of prescription medications used during pregnancy. In fact, it's at the level of cocktail, right? And we're not talking about aspirin, Demerol, oxycodone, and other very powerful medications. Now, they also track class and education because the researchers want to know, well, who are taking these drugs, these very powerful opiates? White, wealthy, educated women who are not coming under the guise of the state, the surveillance of the state for this drug use. So there are inconsistencies here. Opiates are opiates. And even though there are some who've tried to tell me, well, there's a real difference here because doctors at least are tracking when they're prescribing these medications to these women, as it turns out, doctors will say they feel enormous pressure from their patients to provide what it is that their patients want.